Sheri Williamson is a lifelong naturalist, birder, and conservationist known internationally for her research on hummingbirds. She's co-founder and director naturalist of the Southeastern Arizona Bird Observatory. After more than 20 years of general birding and hawk watching, Sheri's life got hijacked by hummingbirds when she and her husband and colleague Tom Wood moved to Arizona to manage the Nature Conservancy's Ramsey Canyon Preserve. A quarter century later, Sheri's still obsessed with these rainbow-hued warriors, feeding them year-round, maintaining a hummingbird garden, writing about them in her blog, and banding hundreds of them every year. As Dave mentioned, she's currently working on an updated and upgraded version of the book she wrote in 2002, which was a field guide to the hummingbirds of North America. And that's part of the Peterson Field Guide series. So you can look for when that upgraded version is available, when it will be released. So Sheri, we're pleased to have you as our speaker tonight.
I am delighted to be here, Bill. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks to everyone with Denver Field Ornithologists for having me tonight. This is quite a lovely thing to be able to visit you virtually and give you a little presentation on my favorite topic. Well, I appreciate the introduction from Bill. As I often say, I wish there was a field guide to field guide authors so that you could recognize us out in the field. Most field guide authors don't get their pictures on their own books. So this is me, in case you want to see me in my, as I said, my basic plumage. I'm in my alternate plumage tonight. I'm a little dressed up because this is the first time I've had to give an opportunity to give a presentation in the last year during the pandemic. So this is what I normally look like, though. So it's a little easier to recognize me this way. Hummingbirds really have just taken over my life. I could talk for hours and hours and hours, but I'm going to try not to go over time tonight. Well, there's so much to cover, and it seems like there's new information coming out about hummingbirds every few months. Something new comes out. It's a study on their physiology, a study on their behavior, tracking migration, understanding their digestive physiology so we can understand how they can eat as much sugar as they do and not keel over dead from it. The DNA work that's revealing the underpinnings of their relationships with one another taxonomically. So many changes. Most of you are aware that there's been quite a lot of changes in the checklist order, at least among the tropical hummingbirds, a few name changes that reflect some of those taxonomic changes as well. So it can be hard to keep up with all of that. I'm just going to touch on a few of those things. Mostly, I just want to pump up the enthusiasm for hummingbirds because they are fantastic, fabulous little birds, and greatly underrated for their ferocity and just general interest. They truly are miniaturized marvels. Hummingbirds are scaled down so far to be as small as a bird can be and still function. Not all hummingbirds are tiny, of course, but the smallest hummingbirds are among the smallest warm-blooded creatures on Earth. It truly is amazing the things that the adaptations that hummingbirds have that enable them to be as tiny as they are, including just scaling down the amount of DNA present in the nucleus of their cells. They have much less DNA in their cells than we have in ours. So they've actually streamlined their genomes to get rid of a lot of the junk DNA, as some call it, to have smaller cells, more efficient circulation and of nutrients and oxygen to those cells. And this is one of the ways that they can do the incredible things that they do. The hummingbirds have been admired by human beings ever since the first hummingbird met the first human being. And they have been extremely important to many indigenous cultures around North America. The native associations with hummingbirds tend to be radically different from our own associations with hummingbirds. These are people who lived with them intimately. For many indigenous cultures, the hummingbirds had religious significance. They often marked the passings of the seasons, especially for northern people, northern cultures. They were associated with the coming of spring, with rain. the coming of the rainy season. And here in the desert Southwest, that's a very important cultural association with hummingbirds. And of course, they're admired all the way to today. They are still fascinate people, whether they're accomplished artists and illustrators like John Gould, the 19th century monograph author and artist, or whether they're just folks who just like hummingbirds and like having tchotchkes with hummingbirds on them and tea towels, and they have a little flag in their garden with a hummingbird on it. People love hummingbirds at all levels, and there are not very many groups of birds for which that's true. Birds of prey at the other end of the scale are that the other group of birds that comes to mind when we think of birds that really transcend the boundaries between just average folks and rabid birders. Their colors and their charisma are just not to be beat. They're tiny, but they pack like a very, very small package. So many different colors, almost all of these colors created by the magical interactions between light and tiny, tiny structures within the feathers. We'll get to that in a moment. Their small size, they just seem impossibly small. They are the only birds that are more often mistaken for insects and vice versa. And that's a pretty phenomenal thing. The very smallest hummingbird of all, the bee hummingbird of Cuba, weighs less than 2 grams, less than a dime. Tiny, tiny little creatures. And yet they pack an awful lot, again, into that tiny, tiny package. One of the things that our northern hummingbirds tend to excel at that is mind-boggling when you think of it on the scale that they're operating at is migration. The little rufous hummingbird, of course, is the champion. Rufous hummingbirds travel from the Pacific Northwest all the way up to southeastern Alaska, and most of them spend their winters in central and southern Mexico. An increasing number are spending their winters along the Gulf Coast and the southeastern states, even up the Atlantic seaboard. I've been tracking a number of my friends and social media contacts this winter who have had overwintering rufous, all the way up to like New Jersey and points even further north of that. And a lot of citizen scientists, community scientists are assisting researchers in helping to understand why these birds are changing their ranges, how they're adapting to climate change, how they're adapting to the radical changes that humans have wrought on the landscape, some good, most bad. And the rufous hummingbird is one of those species that is of particular interest because you could see it almost anywhere in North America. It truly is an amazing creature. Rufous hummingbirds, that little green hummingbird silhouette up there in Alaska represents a little juvenile female rufous hummingbird that made a very long journey, her very first southward migration. She ended up in Tallahassee, Florida. She got a band on her in Tallahassee, and it was only when she returned to Alaska the following summer that we realized what a long journey she had made. That may go down as the longest journey of a hummingbird, at least in proportion to body size, perhaps the longest journey of any bird between its winter home and its summer home. About 3,500 miles for a bird that's about 3.5 inches long. That sounds like a good word problem for a middle school kid to me. Rufous hummingbirds were probably also the very first hummingbirds to encounter human beings. When the ancient people of Asia crossed the Bering Land Bridge or came around it in boats or however they got here and found the bounty of prey that was perhaps missing in the parts of Asia that they were from, they found lots of other wildlife as well, and the wildlife found them. And I just have this image of those early mammoth hunters crossing the Bering Land Bridge into what's now southeastern Alaska and being confronted by a rufous hummingbird telling them to get the heck off his lawn. The other iconic hummingbird that does an amazing migration and of course is familiar to folks east of the Great Plains is the ruby-throated hummingbird. Their wintering homes go all the way down just barely into the westernmost part of Panama. And yet they also migrate all the way up to the maritime provinces of Canada and way across the boreal forest all the way to the very easternmost part of British Columbia. They are an amazing bird adapted for those those ancient, virtually endless forests of the East that unfortunately have been ravaged by human development for residential use, for livestock and agriculture, for mining and all these other things. And yet the ruby-throated manages to hang on and is still prospering in many of its old haunts, thanks to a level of adaptability to taking care of business in marginal habitats like suburban areas and second growth woodlots and places like that. They truly are remarkable creatures, ruby-throateds are. Ruby-throated and rufous are our two truly iconic North American hummingbirds, and we've learned so much just by studying those two species, and yet we have quite a few more. Ruby-throated hummingbird is one that used to be considered not a Western bird at all. It was very, very unusual for them to ever show up anywhere west of the Great Plains. They do nest all the way over into north central Texas and over into the and up through central Oklahoma as well, where they overlap with the black-chinned hummingbird. But for a very long time, we just took for granted that ruby-throated hummingbirds were not coming through the western migration routes. And then people really started to pay attention and started learning some of the subtle field marks that differentiate ruby-throateds from black-chins. And lo and behold, ruby-throated hummingbirds started showing up in places that they'd never been seen before. This little bird was in our very own backyard in southeastern Arizona, in Bisbee, Arizona, right on the Mexican border. This was only the 6th known ruby-throated hummingbird in Arizona. And I had the privilege of banding the very first known ruby-throated, not very many years before this guy showed up in our yard. So we're still learning about these birds and still finding out that they have the capacity to surprise us. The broad-billed hummingbird is a special bird from the standpoint of vagrancy, birds out of what we think of as their normal places. Broad-billed hummingbirds are not as strongly migratory. They don't have the well-defined migration instincts that a lot of other hummingbirds do, that broadtails and rufous and calliope and ruby-throateds and black-chins do. And so they sometimes get a little confused. Their little compasses get a little wonky and they get a little confused. Broad-billed hummingbird has been seen only a handful of times, perhaps, maybe only these 3 times I'm going to mention in Colorado. But what's amazing about this is that 2 of the first three broad-billed hummingbirds that had ever been seen in Colorado had been banded as overwintering birds in southern Louisiana. The first one was an amazing thing and just a real shocker for everyone, including the banders involved. And the second one, though, starts to look like a pattern. So we still don't understand exactly what's going on. We're still not even sure where those broad-billed hummingbirds that are overwintering in Louisiana and points east of there are coming from. They could be coming from northeastern Mexico. They could be coming from as far away as Arizona and northwestern Mexico. We just don't know. But when you have 2 birds banded in winter in Louisiana, both of them show up in Colorado, that suggests there's something very interesting going on that we don't quite grasp yet. They are tiny birds, but they have huge brains. They're incredibly smart little birds. Again, with the tiny, tiny cells, with the tiny little packets of DNA in them, in their brains, they can pack a lot more neurons into those tiny little heads than you might imagine. Bird brain is actually a compliment. Birds actually have very sophisticated brains and brains that are very streamlined in their function in many ways, and hummingbirds are the epitome of that. Their brains are actually larger in proportion to body size than human brains. So we need to not be bragging about how big our brains are when we're talking about birds. Even songbirds, that is the case. Bird brain truly is a compliment. They also have to power those brains with a lot of energy, and they pack it on in the form of sugar-rich flower nectar. Hummingbirds can burn energy at an incredible rate. The tiny ones like the rufous, calliope, ruby-throated, the small ones that are only weigh about as much as a penny or less, they can burn calories at up to 10 times the rate that a mourning dove does and 100 times that of an elephant. They are real powerhouses. And that, of course, that means that they are mere hours away from starvation almost any time in their lives. The big difference there is that for the purposes of migration, these birds can more than double their body weight at times. And so they can carry a huge load of fat that gives them a reserve of energy that allows them to go 24 or 36 hours or more without eating as long as they have a good fat deposits on them. Those flowers that they feed on aren't just any flowers. The flowers that hummingbirds tend to prefer, the ones that give them exactly what they need, are ones that have co-evolved with hummingbirds. Many of them have brilliant colors in the hot zone of the spectrum, in the reds and oranges and hot pinks, but they actually come in a variety of colors. Their hummingbirds are nothing if not adaptable, and they will readily feed at plants with any number of different colors of flowers, and purples, even whites. Yellow, we usually associate that with bee pollinated and insect pollinated plants, and yet there are plants like the yellow bells there at the bottom center that are very popular with migrating hummingbirds. I've seen hundreds of ruby-throated hummingbirds working hillsides of the yellow bells blooming in eastern Mexico, in Veracruz, Mexico, during the fall migration, during the River of Raptors phenomenon. The ruby-throateds are also moving through eastern Mexico by the millions and are feeding on many different flowers, including the yellow bells that bloom at that time. Some of the flower types and flower shapes that appeal to hummingbirds are a little on the surprising side. Manzanita is a very early blooming plant for us down here in southeastern Arizona, and it's a very important nectar source, not only for our early little native bees, which can climb right in those tiny little white urn-shaped flowers, but also for hummingbirds like the broad-tailed and rufous hummingbirds. Those early arrivals take advantage of the nectar of the manzanita flowers, and by pollinating those flowers, they're oddly enough helping to support bears, because the manzanita fruits are extremely important fall forage for bears as they prepare to go into hibernation. There are a few species of cacti, mostly tropical, that are pollinated by hummingbirds, and also even thistles. The thistle there at the bottom left of the screen is our Arizona thistle, one of Arizona's specialties, that doesn't have that powder puff effect. The flower never opens up fully into a powder puff-like formation. It always stays partly closed like a paintbrush to help facilitate hummingbird pollination. Of course, you get into the tropics and you get much longer and more exclusive relationships between hummingbirds and their plants. The most famous, perhaps, is the sword-billed hummingbird and the plants that it pollinates, which include this long red passion flower, which is a fairly common plant in parts of the western Andean Cordillera of western South America. They also feed on a plant that's a close relative of our angel's trumpets, or datura, here in the southwestern United States. Although the flowers of this plant, instead of being creamy white with a lavender tinge and highly fragrant, the sword-billed hummingbird pollinated version of datura, the Jimson weed or angel's trumpets, is reddish at the lips, and it points straight down, so the birds come in from below. There are truly some bizarre plants in the tropics that are pollinated specifically by hummingbirds. And in many cases, the shape of the bird's bill, the length, the curvature, the thickness of it, even sometimes the hook on the tip or even little teeth inside the tip are aids to them exploiting these nectar resources. And of course, one of the things that endears hummingbirds to us is they're not shy about taking human handouts. In fact, they get quite a sense of entitlement about it, as anybody who's fed hummingbirds knows pretty well. That's one of the easiest ways that you can attract hummingbirds to your yard. It's probably the way that most people start their interest in hummingbirds, is by buying a hummingbird feeder and hopefully filling it with nice plain sugar water and not any kind of weird red stuff from the grocery aisle, pet aisle in the grocery store. The feeders, though, can be a bit of a double-edged sword. People sometimes get very upset when they put out a feeder and all of a sudden the hummingbirds are fighting over it. They're screaming and squawking and body slamming each other and carrying on. But when you're a creature with such a high metabolism and you live within hours of starvation pretty much every day of your life, you can't afford to share. So there is no word for share in a hummingbird's vocabulary. Sometimes there's an armed truce when the hummingbirds are really desperate to feed, like in the evening, during bad weather, during the height of migration, when everybody's just concentrating on packing on that fat to travel. Sometimes you get a little bit of détente around the feeders, but mostly it's just a free-for-all. It's particularly intense, of course, during migration, and that includes the Rocky Mountains in August and also the Gulf Coast of the Texas and Louisiana and the eastern U.S. during September. September is a great time to be at Rockport, Texas, along the coast, where you can find massive swarms of ferocious ruby-throated hummingbirds that have completely driven out the milder mannered black-chinned hummingbirds. Although occasionally amongst them, you'll find a rufous duking it out with the ruby-throateds, bellied hummingbirds, and occasionally other surprises as well. And of course, in the Rocky Mountains, we have the major migration route for rufous, broad-tailed, and calliope hummingbirds moving south out of the mountainous west down into Mexico for the winter. And of course, there are times when our feeders, it can be hard to keep even very large feeders like this one full and clean, with the birds just frantically sucking that nectar down as quick as they can to pack on those grams of fat. Hummingbirds are extremely efficient at that. They can take that sugar water, and except for the energy that they have to use to process the excess water in the nectar, they can convert that to energy, convert that to high energy fat with only about a 20% loss of the energy value of the sugar. These guys are absolutely pros at what they do. That ferocity around the feeders is something that was observed long before there were feeders. The native people of the Americas often associated hummingbirds with war. And that's particularly true of the Aztecs, for whom their chief deity, Huitzilopochtli, was the god of war and also the god of the sun. And one of the I think, quite charming things of the Aztec beliefs about hummingbirds is that warriors who died in battle and women who died in childbirth, which the Aztecs considered to be a different kind of battle, were transformed into hummingbirds and served as the bodyguards of Huitzilopochtli as he passed through the dangerous and devilish underworld at night to rise again in the east in the morning. They were his servants and his bodyguards. And that it really tickles me thinking of these ferocious little jewel-like birds guiding the god of war through the underworld at night. Hummingbirds are also an ancient family of birds. They're a lot older than we knew because, of course, tiny creatures, it's very, very hard for them to ever get fossilized at all. And it takes just the right combination of local characteristics for the birds to end up as fossils and for humans to find them and study them. Amazingly enough, the only true fossils that we have of hummingbirds come from Europe, from Germany and France. There's a genus of hummingbirds, extinct hummingbirds, Eurotrochilus, the European hummingbird, and the original type specimen was named Eurotrochilus inexpectatus, the unexpected European hummingbird. These birds lived around 30 million years ago. We think that hummingbirds originated around 40 plus million years ago, 42 to 44 million years ago, splitting off from their last common ancestor with the swifts. Swifts have been confirmed as the closest living relatives of hummingbirds. And somehow they flourished in Europe, probably into Asia as well, because there are certain plants that have been identified in the Himalayas and Himalayan region that show all of the signs that they were adapted to pollination by hummingbirds. And yet, of course, there are no hummingbirds to pollinate them anymore. They're now secondarily pollinated by insects for the most part. But somehow or another, hummingbirds flourished in the old world, and then they died out there. We don't know exactly why. Perhaps the shifting continents made migration problematical for them. Obviously, climate changes. It was very swampy and warm and humid in France and Germany at the time that this little specimen was laid down. But one of the things that's fascinating about these fossils is how much they look like our modern hummingbirds. Even 30 million years ago, if we could look back in time and see these birds flitting around the marshes and swamps and forests of Europe at that time, we would recognize them as hummingbirds. They look so much like our modern birds. Somehow or another, at some point around 22 million years ago, hummingbirds arrived in the New World and they made it to South America. We're still not sure exactly how they skipped over North America, but they made it to South America and began to gain a foothold there. And it's from South America, mostly northwestern South America, that all of the hummingbirds that we know today have radiated. The group of hummingbirds most familiar to us are called the bee hummingbirds, the tiny little guys that the males generally have glowing iridescent throats. And that's this group right here. And notice that all those little lines are quite short. The bee hummingbird group arose only about 5 million years ago, and that's an eye blink in geologic time. Only about 5 million years ago, and our most familiar hummingbirds split off from their last common ancestor only maybe between 1.5 and 2 million years ago. Species like black-chinned and ruby-throated. It's pretty obvious when you're looking at something like Allens and rufus, because they still look a lot alike and they still interbreed. They have not been separated as a discrete species for very long, and some would argue that perhaps they're not all that discrete. And you notice that the shape of that pink area next to the little bee hummingbird representative there on the graph, that indicates that their evolution just took off like a shot. And you can still see that they are continuing to evolve. And we probably haven't seen the last of the radiation of bee hummingbirds. They seem to be really taking a very interesting route evolutionarily to have invaded North America, made it their own, and then they radiated back into Central and South America and through the Caribbean, so that now there are representatives of this group throughout the range of hummingbirds, pretty much, including the little tiny wood stars down in sheartails down in Central America and South America. Speaking of Central and South America, it's truly in the tropics that hummingbirds reach their ultimate diversity and their ultimate glory. I have been so lucky in my life to have visited some fantastic hummingbird hotspots. And among my favorites is Ecuador. You just can't beat Ecuador. The diversity of hummingbird species for such a small country is phenomenal. And you can even see a fairly radically different group of hummingbirds on one side of the Andes versus the other. It's that distinctive a demarcation line between the East and the West in Ecuador, that you have counterpart species like we do on a continent-wide basis here in North America, ruby-throated and black-chinned, for example, as well as many, many songbirds. The colors and shapes and behaviors, sizes even, of the tropical hummingbirds are phenomenal. It's just an endless palette of colors and textures and behaviors. Some hummingbirds are fantastic singers. Some, like the marvelous spatuletail, a critically endangered species found only in Peru, are incredible dancers, do amazing courtship displays that rival some of the courtship displays of some of the birds of paradise in New Guinea. Here in North America, our selection of hummingbirds and the diversity of species and the diversity of adaptations isn't as extravagant as it is in South America, and yet we have an enviable diversity of birds, especially in the Western US. We truly have some marvelous creatures, and we are, in fact, the envy of many people in parts of the world where hummingbirds no longer occur. There's a worldwide following of hummingbirds, but only here in the Americas are we lucky enough to live beside them. They are a tremendously diverse family of birds as well. They're the second largest bird family after the flycatchers, with 350 plus species. There's obviously a little give and take. Sometimes species get lumped, but more often they're looking at the DNA and looking at distribution and habitat preferences and things like that, and are finding that within what we originally considered a single species, there may be 3 or 4 or even 5 different species with very, very subtle differences in where they live and what they look like. The flycatchers obviously are fabulous creatures in their own right, and they're also very thoughtful creatures. Notice how this vermilion flycatcher is deep in reflection. Northern hummingbird diversity is a lot greater across the US and Canada than most people realize too. I mean, obviously everybody knows Mexico has a lot of tropical habitats, and so it has quite a few hummingbird species. So over 50 species of hummingbirds are found in Mexico, including all the ones that are found in the United States. all but one of the ones that are found in the United States, have been found in the United States. But a lot of people are surprised when I throw this map up and they see how many species of hummingbirds have been recorded in their home state, because I cannot count the number of times someone has said to me, oh, well, I live in insert eastern state name here, so I only get one hummingbird. No, you don't. Nunavut up here in northern Canada is the only state or province that is short on hummingbirds. Ruby-throated has been recorded there, but I figure there's going to be a rufous there eventually. Every other state and province, except for Hawaii, of course, has at least records of 2 species, usually ruby-throated and rufous in those eastern states and provinces. But there's a surprising number of tropical, even tropical hummingbirds and western and southwestern hummingbirds that have made it to the eastern and central United States and even to southern Canada. Broad-billed hummingbird, Mexican violet ear, even green-breast mango have showed up in places that we wouldn't necessarily expect them, and have contributed to the hummingbird diversity that many of these states can claim. Now, it may be a one-off thing, but in some cases, we've got states that are like Louisiana, for example, that may have a dozen species of hummingbirds present as wintering birds every single winter. I know of folks in Louisiana who are enthusiastic hummingbird feeders and gardeners who have had up to 40 individual hummingbirds of 6 species in their yard over the course of a single winter. So there's some pretty phenomenal hummingbird action going on you just have to be on the lookout for it. I think that's one of the reasons why people get taken by surprise when some weird hummingbird shows up out of what we think should be its normal range of distribution. One of the most fantastic examples of this, in fact, is I needed to point out Colorado, because Colorado is one of those little rectangular states that everybody always gets confused. I just wanted to let you know I know where Colorado is. One of the most fantastic records that we've got is a fairly recent one. An amethyst-throated mountain gem, one of the big hummingbirds, a close relative of our blue-throated hummingbird or blue-throated mountain gem out in the southwestern US and northern Mexico, turned up in Quebec of all places. Fortunately, it didn't come and go at a feeder without being noticed. Somebody noticed it. They got great photos, very, very well documented. And of course, that bird had to fly across a good portion of the United States to get from the portions of Mexico where it's native to Quebec. So it probably visited feeders and gardens along the way and was just not detected. That was a bit of a blow to American birders, because we were a little disappointed that nobody picked this burly stranger up on his way north. However, just a matter of months later, in Texas, another amethyst-throated mountain gem, only the second ever seen north of Mexico, showed up on the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology West Texas hummingbird cam. The viewers saw this big, strange-looking hummingbird. They alerted the admin for the webcam program, and they were able to alert the homeowner, our friend and colleague Kelly Bryan, who was able to race in from an errand in town in Fort Davis, Texas, race home to his cabin in the mountains, and record this incredible first record for the United States, amethyst-throated mountain gem. It was a particularly exciting sighting for me. Not only is it exciting to have an entirely new species of hummingbird show up in the United States, but it was exciting for me because the original Peterson Field Guide to Hummingbirds, published in early 2002, included 5 species that I considered to be potential vagrants from Mexico that might show up someday north of the border. And so that people would be watching for them, I included them in the guide. And these are the 5, including amethyst-throated mountain gem. Cha-ching. Now we need the other 4. It might take another half of a lifetime to get the other 4 to show up. But I was pretty gratified when my prediction that amethyst-throated mountain gem might show up in the United States actually came true. Hummingbirds, one of the things that people end up being quite uncomfortable about with hummingbirds, and it can lead, unfortunately or fortunately, to some very bad human behavior, is that hummingbirds are ferociously territorial. They are savage beasts, And they do knock down, drag out, brawling. That can be rather uncomfortable to watch, like in this case where we had a young and evidently rather sick little juvenile male Anna's hummingbird that just dragged an adult female off the feeder and just took her to the ground and held her on the ground for several minutes. It can be very uncomfortable to watch these things. Now, this is part of their nature. They fight over flowers as well as fighting over feeders. So it's just part of their nature to be little junkyard dogs driving everybody out of their particular little patch. Some hummingbirds, of course, are more aggressive than others. Anna's and Rufus are particularly aggressive. Blue-throated mountain gems are particularly savage. Some of the other species are a little more mild-mannered and get along a little bit better with one another. One of those comparisons that I like to cite is the Allen's versus Rufus hummingbirds. Rufus are savage. Allen's hummingbirds do fight, but they're not quite as ferocious as Rufus. They have that laid-back California attitude by hummingbird standards. A very important part of both their, quote, social life, unquote, and also their reproductive life is visual communication. Hummingbirds do a lot of communication just with the colors on their bodies, the patterns on their bodies, and also their body language, how they behave. Iridescence is a big part of that, of course. The iridescence that makes up the gorget or throat coloration of most of our familiar hummingbirds is highly directional, and the males can control who sees that color and how they see it by simply angling their head at different angles to the eyes that are looking at them. If it's the eyes of a lady, of course, they're going to want to shine those colors. They also like to shine those colors into the eyes of rival males as well. But they're amazingly good at concealing those colors. And that's another one of those very common hummingbird identification questions is, what kind of hummingbird has a black head? Well, it could be, or a black throat. It could be almost any of them if you're seeing them at the wrong angle or you're seeing them in poor light. Those iridescent structures inside the feather are so tiny that they really can only be picked up and studied through very sophisticated microscopy. When the electron microscope was introduced, it really revolutionized our understanding of how these tiny particles within the feathers of hummingbirds interact with light and make these incredible colors out of just ordinary white sunlight. What the structures inside the hummingbird's feathers are called platelets. They're discs, cookie-like flattened discs of melanin, the same pigment that gives us our hair and skin and eye color. And yet hummingbirds are using it in a way that few other birds other than the quetzals can use iridescence. They are using that melanin structure to break the light up into its component parts. The melanin, when it's in such a thin layer as this, it's translucent. The light comes down into the center of the platelet and bounces around inside little bubbles, little vacuoles that act like little spherical mirrors. And as the light bounces around, different wavelengths are moving at different speeds. And some of those wavelengths end up being canceled out. Some of them end up being amplified through interference effects. And it all shoots out of the bird's feathers and back to the viewer's eye in these very pure spectral hues. Even these brilliant iridescent colors, though, can suffer from wear and damage to the feather. This is a male Anna's hummingbird at the very end of his plumage cycle, when he's just about ready to dump those old worn gorget feathers and replace them with shiny, brilliant new ones for the breeding season. And you can see how the purple feathers are the brand new ones. They very quickly go from purple to a vivid rose pink. But the edges of the feathers that have gotten the most wear, that have gotten the most exposure to sun, are the most damaged and are reflecting very different colors than you would normally expect just from looking at the field guide illustrations of Anna's hummingbird. Broad-tailed hummingbirds get a very similar phenomenon as you get into late summer and the birds are beginning to wrap up their breeding season and they're heading south. Those vivid hot pink feathers that are hot pink in the spring become tinged with coppery pinks and oranges. And it's the same phenomenon that we see in those Anna's hummingbird feathers. The abrasion and damage by UV light causes changes that we don't quite understand in how these feathers refract light And so you get these very different colors refracting out of the feathers as they become damaged. Of course, the other end of the bird is very important as well. And that's something that it's very important from an ID standpoint. Not only are humans identifying hummingbirds by their tail patterns, by the amount and distribution of color in the tail, by the shapes of the tail feathers as well, but hummingbirds are also identifying each other by these cues as well. The amount of rufous in the tail, for example, is going to tell you whether you're looking at an adult female or juvenile female or juvenile male rufous hummingbird. Broad-tailed hummingbirds, the juvenile males and females of all ages, have lesser amounts of rufous in the tail, but longer tail feathers and very large white spots on the tips. And of course, the calliope has very little rufous at all, and yet those guys will fan those tails and fuss at each other in flight, even though they don't have those brilliant orange colors to show off like the rufous and the broad-tailed do. Sound is also extremely important, just like it is with other birds. Not all of our hummingbirds sing, though. Anna's is one of the exceptions to the northern hummingbird general rule that we don't have a whole lot of singers in the northern temperate zones. Ruby-throated and black-chinned hummingbirds are not big singers. Rufous don't sing, Allens don't sing, calliopes don't sing, broad-taileds don't sing. Anna's hummingbirds and Costa's hummingbirds and many of our southwestern birds that are peripheral Mexican birds that just slop over the border into the southwestern US, that's where you find the singers, the true vocalists in hummingbirds. All hummingbirds make sounds of one kind or another. They make chips and screeches and squawks and gurgles and growls, depending on what the context is, including lots of very ugly language when they're interacting over food resources. But the sounds that they make specifically to ward off rivals during the breeding season, and also the potential for attracting mates, those can be very special. And when I say special, I mean very interesting. I don't necessarily mean particularly musical. Anna's hummingbirds, when they sing, they sound like somebody dragging their nails across a blackboard. It's not a happy sound. It's just these scratchy notes. And yet the males still, they close their eyes when they croon and very gently open just the tip of their beak as though they're singing the most beautiful love song on the planet. And hey, as long as the ladies like it, who am I to judge? But there are better vocalists in the hummingbird world. But not all of the sounds that are associated with territoriality and courtship come from the voice. Some of our hummingbirds have wing sounds, as the folks in the Rockies know very, very well. The broad-tailed hummingbird has one of the most beautiful wing sounds of any bird. It is truly a musical, magical sound to hear a broad-tailed male flying overhead and that silvery rippling trill coming from those wingtips. The wingtips, the outer two primary feathers, are very distinctly modified in broad-tailed hummingbird to create that pulsing silvery trill that they make in flight, that males make in flight. And they don't, one of the interesting things is they don't always have to make that sound. A male in migration that's maybe stopping in at a flower patch or a feeding station for the first time may silence his trill simply by dampening down the gap between the feathers that allows the air to pass through the wingtip and create that silvery trill. And they can go incognito that way until they learn who the players are. And then once they feel confident enough, they may start resuming that trill again. This was a discovery made at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum when they captured a male broad-tailed hummingbird to add to the captive collection. They put him in quarantine and he was flying around his quarantine cage, trilling up a storm. Then when they put him in the main population in the aviary with the other hummingbirds, he stopped trilling and they were terrified. They thought something terrible had happened to those trilling feathers on his wings. And so they caught him up, but no, he was perfectly fine. It took him maybe a week or two to get confident enough in the aviary around the Costas and the Annas and the broadbills and other species present there as inmates to start trilling again. But it does show that they have some level of conscious control over the sounds that their wings make. Rufous hummingbirds also have a wing trill. It's less a trill than it is a savage sounding whine, like Darth Vader's lightsaber zipping through the air on its way to whack Luke Skywalker. The sound is created by the outer 4 or 5 wingtip feathers, tips of the primary feathers of the outer 4 or 5 primaries, which have a sharp hooked little claw almost at the very tip, almost like a kitten's claw. And that sharp little tip creates turbulence in the air that creates that whining drone sound that is the distinctive sound for adult male rufous and Allen's hummingbirds as they go zipping through the air. Strikes terror into the hearts of lesser hummingbirds. Even black-chinned and ruby-throated hummingbirds have modified primary feathers, although the sounds they make are not as loud or quite as distinctive and recognizable as those of rufous and Allen's and broad-tailed. But once you start listening to male black-chinned hummingbirds, which are apparently having quite a renaissance in eastern Colorado following the residential development and gardens and irrigated landscapes out into the prairies. But once you start to listen to male black-chinned hummingbirds, you can hear a low, dull drone to their wings. And even females and juvenile males have a similar sound, just much lower, quieter than it is in the adult males. It's a sound you can learn to pick up and impress your friends. Once we get back to having backyard barbecues, you can say, oh, there goes a black-chinned hummingbird overhead. Anna's hummingbird is a great example, one that's been very well studied, of another class of sounds that hummingbirds make. It's not just the wing feathers that make amazing sounds in some species of hummingbirds, but the tail feathers as well. The B group of hummingbirds is famous for doing what are called dive displays, where they go high into the air and plunge earthward at incredibly rapid speeds for their size. And at a certain point in this dive, each species makes a characteristic sound. There's been some argument over the generations of naturalists and ornithologists over what exactly makes the sound, but a study done a few years back by some college students in California determined that in the case of Anna's hummingbird, and there's been follow-ups on other species that have verified for them as well, it's the modified tail feathers that make these sounds that they make during the dive display. In the case of Anna's, it's sort of a raspberry, a sound at the very bottom of the dive. And toward the of his affections, a female perched on in this case, a stuffed female, wired to a branch to get the males to perform in front of the camera. He plunges earthward at rapid speed, and then just at the bottom of his dive, he flares his tail feathers out to 180 degrees. And that's the point at which you hear this sound. And it's coming from vibrations of the outermost tail feathers, which are long and thin, shaped like a skinny popsicle stick. In order to get those sounds out of that feather, though, the bird has to be moving at about 60 miles an hour, which is incredible. In proportion to the size, this bird's moving faster than the space shuttle to get that sound. They were able to verify that that particular feather produces a sound by plucking that feather and blowing air over it at 60 miles an hour, and it creates that same tone. It's vibrating like the reed in a woodwind instrument. And other hummingbirds that do those dive displays, have those slightly different modifications to their tail feathers, the needle-like outer tail feathers of Allen's hummingbirds, the steak knife-like outer tail feathers of rufous hummingbirds, even the pointed tail feathers of black-chinned and ruby-throated males make these distinctive sounds that are part of the courtship and territorial repertoire of these little bee hummingbirds. Once the romance is done and and the females are ready to go off and be single moms, because male hummingbirds don't participate in the nesting at all, she's got to go find a good spot to build that nest and raise those kids where they'll be safe from weather, safe from predators, and she'll have abundant resources nearby. One of the resources that's something that we can provide to help bring hummingbirds to our gardens is nest material. Using natural fibers, some people use unbleached cotton, actually wool, and even clean pesticide-free pet hair is preferable because it has greater insulating value and is more water resistant than cotton. But hummingbirds will take really any kind of light colored fiber. They particularly like white and very pale cream colored fibers that tend to blend their eggs in color-wise with the bottom of the nest. The eggs are sort of a whitish to pale pinkish color of the shell, and having white nest lining helps to disguise the fact that there are eggs in the nest until those eggs hatch into tiny little baby hummingbirds. The female is a single parent. She gathers the nest material, selects the nest site, builds the nest, lays the eggs, incubates the eggs, does all of this stuff entirely on her own with no help from the male. And it takes a lot of dedication. These little moms, not only do they spend about 7 to 8 weeks caring for their young from the time they lay the eggs to the time the young are independent and able to feed on their own, but they will drive away predators from their nests, predators many times their size. Jays, birds of prey, even things like snakes and big lizards are not safe from a mother hummingbird. She is a ferocious defender of her youngsters. And those babies do grow very, very fast. Within about 10 days, their little eyes are opened and their feathers are beginning to pop out, and they go from cold-blooded little naked nestlings to fluffy little warm-blooded nestlings with voracious appetites. The mother may visit the nest dozens of times a day, depending on how easy it is to find food. She's stuffing these babies not only with nectar, which is important later when their energy needs are great as they start exercising their wings, but mainly with little invertebrates, with arthropods like flies, beetles, gnats, mosquitoes, and lots of spiders. Spiders are brain food for birds. A study in Europe found that some members of the titmouse and chickadee family were preferentially feeding their nestlings on spiders. So they did a nutritional analysis of the spiders, found that they're very high in taurine, which it builds good brains and nervous systems. And hummingbirds, those big brains, you don't build those big brains on poor food. So mother hummingbirds are feeding a lot of spiders to their babies, as well as robbing the spiders' webs for building material just to make their nests. Baby hummingbirds come out of the nest the size of their parents, and that can be sometimes a little embarrassing. This young white-eared hummingbird, baby boy, was ferociously defending a feeder to feeding station in the Copper Canyon of northwestern Mexico, and just acted so tough. He was singing and chasing all the other birds away. But as soon as his mama came around, he turned right back into a little fledgling and begged her to be fed. And he's probably a little bigger than she is, since in white-eared hummingbirds, the males average a little bit heavier than the females do. And he's probably got quite a lot of baby fat from being well fed by this very dedicated mother. Sometimes when a female hummingbird doesn't find a male of her species, when it's time to mate, when her biological clock is ticking and she has an empty nest that needs eggs in it, sometimes she'll settle for whoever comes down the line. I call this the Mr. Right Now phenomenon. And we get hybrid hummingbirds. There are now around 40 different hybrid combinations recorded in North America, north of Mexico, including this celebrity who was found at the Baby's Guest Ranch in Miller Canyon here in southeastern Arizona for about 5 years. He dominated the feeder every summer. One of his parents, probably a female, was a barreline. And she apparently had a fling with a male Rivley's hummingbird and created the bird we call the Magnifiline. This little female hummingbird visited our yard several years ago in the fall, and I heard this sound that was not right. I heard a call note that sounded like it was halfway between a black-chinned, which has a very nasal voice, and the hoarser, drier chip notes of an Anna's hummingbird. And sure enough, when I finally got a look at her, that's absolutely what she was. She had quite an interesting mix of characteristics of those two species all crammed into one tiny little body. The males are ever so much easier to identify, though. This is another one of our named celebrity hybrids, the Costifer hummingbird, of which there have been at least 3 individuals in the Huachuca Mountains at Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary, which the Southeastern Arizona Bird Observatory now owns and manages. There was even a Costifer hummingbird that was photographed at the sanctuary this spring, although nobody has reported it since. But this guy was around for several years, well photographed and well studied. He sang a Costas type song. So we're pretty confident that his other parent, besides Lucifer, from which he got the very, very long tail, that his other parent was a Costas hummingbird. And hybrid hummingbirds have actually been known for more than 100 years. One of the earliest identified hybrid hummingbirds was a bird that was originally described as a full species called Salvin's hummingbird. The very first specimen was collected down in Jalisco in southwestern Mexico, but later several specimens were collected in California, one of which had been mounted to wear on a hat. This was back in the bad old days before the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And eventually the ornithologists began to put two and two together and realized that this wasn't a unique species. It was in fact a hybrid between Allen's and Anna's hummingbirds. So now that once they realized that hummingbirds were hybridizing, there were a series of papers on identifying these weird one-off hummingbirds as hybrids. But we keep finding new combinations like the Costifer, for example, and the Magnifiline. One of the more interesting hybrids that's just recently come to our attention is this beautiful little bird that was photographed in far western Nebraska. This gorgeous little creature looks kind of like a ruby-throated, and that it's got kind of narrow outer primary feathers, and it's got that red throat. It has a little bit of a dull, sooty colored chin strap, not the solid black velvety chin strap of a ruby-throated. But it has a long forked tail with a deep notch in it, but it also has rufous along the edges of the outer tail feathers. And our best guess from what we can see on this bird is that this bird is a ruby-throated X broad-tailed. Believe it or not, those two don't overlap in range anywhere as far as we know, but apparently a female of one species or the other ended up within the range of the other species, and Mr. Right Now came along and she mated, and this was the product. Here's a comparison with that nice male broad-tailed. You can see a lot of the similarities there, although the wing curves inward rather than having that little bit of an outward flare at the tip. And then there's a comparison with a broad-tailed X black-chinned hummingbird, which is a much better known combination of hybrids that's been well documented in many Western states, including here in Arizona, in Texas. So that's a very well-known one. But the ruby-throated X broad-tailed, that one took us by surprise. Of course, hummingbirds don't exist in a vacuum. They have all the needs that any other wildlife has. And unfortunately, a lot of those needs are going unmet, and we're losing population in our North American hummingbirds. There's the shifting baselines phenomenon where folks who were watching hummingbirds in the Rockies and Western Texas, along the Gulf Coast of Texas, and of course in Southeastern Arizona 30, 40 years ago, would be appalled at what we're seeing now with the low numbers of birds, with the declines in populations. It still looks great to those of us who have less experience than that, but folks who were watching these birds a generation or two ago would be appalled at how few birds there are in many of these areas that once supported many thousands of hummingbirds. And of course, habitat is the big key there. Hummingbirds have got to have habitat. They have to not only have breeding habitat and wintering habitat, but they also have to have stopover habitat all along the way. And fortunately for us, we humans can do quite a lot to help with that by gardening for hummingbirds, by reducing and eliminating the use of pesticides, keeping our cats indoors, making our windows safer to avoid bird collisions. We can help not only hummingbirds, but many other migratory birds. But of course, hummingbirds, because they are attracted to flowers, they're attracted to feeders, we can also provide them with those critical resources that they need during migration especially, but also during the breeding and wintering seasons, by creating backyard habitats, by planting hummingbird-friendly plants, especially native species, by keeping our feeders out there and keeping them clean and full. All these things are ways that we can help to contribute to create little pockets, little havens for hummingbirds as they make their continent-wide travels. Hummingbirds face a lot of natural dangers as well, of course, and among them are predators, some of which are natural. Spiders actually take a minor toll on hummingbirds. The very large orb weaver type spiders, their webs are so big and strong, hummingbirds are sometimes entangled in those webs and occasionally do get eaten by the spider. Sometimes the spider just doesn't want to deal with a prey that big, and they'll cut them out and drop them to the ground and repair their web behind them. But there are records of large spiders and also other large invertebrates eating hummingbirds. Of course, the other class of predators that will eat almost any kind of small bird are birds of prey. And for hummingbirds, it's not just birds like sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks and kestrels and other small true raptors. Even some of the small owls like elf owls and pygmy owls will prey on hummingbirds. But even large songbirds can take hummingbirds. Tanagers and orioles have been recorded as attacking and killing hummingbirds and just gulping them down a hole after tenderizing them a bit by slamming them against a branch. So hummingbirds can be prey not only for birds that eat small birds, but also for birds that eat large insects. Because again, hummingbirds are small enough to be confused with large insects. And when large insects are in short supplies, such as in very severe drought conditions or when there's late freezes, those birds that would otherwise depend on things like tree crickets and katydids and large moths and butterflies and things like that may fall back on hummingbirds as a secondary food source. Mantises are also known to take hummingbirds. Mostly it's the invasive Chinese mantis that you can probably still buy the egg cases out of the back of gardening magazines. But the invasive Chinese mantis is the largest mantis that occurs in North America, and it's therefore the best adapted to feeding on something the size of a hummingbird. Some of our native mantises, our larger native mantises, do take hummingbirds, though. This little black-chinned hummingbird was definitely not falling for it at all. She noticed that mantis perched up on the top of the 4 o'clock in the Wally and Marion Patton's yard in Patagonia, Arizona, and was alerting all the other birds around, letting them know that a predator was nearby. The mantis is hard to see against that green, but she was not fooled. Fire is a double-edged sword for hummingbirds, as it is for many kinds of wildlife. It certainly can destroy nests. It can destroy food resources in the short term, but fire is also followed by bloom. At least natural type fires are followed by bloom. And some of the hummingbird's favorite flowers are highly responsive to fire in a positive way. Plants like the beautiful fireweed and some of the bee balms will come right back after a fire. Here in southeastern Arizona, some of the members of the mint family, like Stachys coccinea, called Texas betony or scarlet hedge nettle, is also a very fire-responsive plant that is thoroughly invigorated by a mild to moderate forest fire. One of the most hummingbird-rich spots I have ever found anywhere in North America was a rocky clearing where there had been a recent wildfire down in the Sierra Madre of western Chihuahua. The flowers were just thick, thousands and thousands of, again, very fire responsive species being swarmed by migrating rufous hummingbirds, as well as the local resident white-eared hummingbirds and Rivley's hummingbirds. Grazing can also have an impact on the hummingbird's nectar resources. Some of the plants that hummingbirds are particularly fond of and that are very important nectar sources for them are also very palatable to livestock and to deer and elk. And either overstocking of livestock or overpopulations of deer and elk can be very injurious to the quality of the resources available to hummingbirds, quality of the nectar resources available to them. There are a number of studies on this, in fact. The things like skyrocket, various species of penstemons, even Indian paintbrush will often be selectively browsed by livestock or by deer and elk, and eliminating that food resource. Imagine that migrating broad-tailed hummingbird coming back to its favorite patch of wildflowers only to find that it has been grazed down to the ground by a herd of cows or sheep or a big herd of elk or deer moving through. That's really tough because a lot of these plants are perennials. They would normally bloom and bloom and bloom year after year after year and provide a reliable food source for these traveling hummingbirds, but not if they're eaten to the ground by livestock. So that can be a real problem. And of course, the big elephant in the room is climate change. Everybody's familiar by now in Colorado with the study that found that there is an increasing disconnect between the timing of the bloom of the glacier lilies, which are an important nectar source for broad-tailed hummingbirds in the spring, and the arrival of broad-tailed hummingbirds on their breeding habitats. As we get further and further into climate change, and there's more and more of these disruptions of the natural synchronicity of wildlife cycles and the cycles of the plants that they depend on, we're going to see increasing stress on these bird populations, as well as stress on the populations of the plants, which need those birds to pollinate. I give broad-tailed hummingbirds a lot of credit, though. These are birds that have been dealing with the harsh and unpredictable climate of the high mountains all the way up to timberline for millions of years. I had firsthand experience of this when a broad-tailed hummingbird nested in the middle of a snowstorm. She did manage to hatch her eggs and raise a baby even when her nest was completely covered in snow. That tiny little beak sticking up surprised the heck out of me. Much of what we know about hummingbirds, it comes from banding studies. And I've been lucky to have banded hummingbirds for as an independent bander for the last 30 years. This is my 30th year banding hummingbirds after our apprentice year in 1990. And it has been truly a privilege and an honor to get to know these birds in such an intimate way. Some of you have probably had the opportunity to watch banders such as Fred and Tina Engelman or Steve and Debbie Baricius banding hummingbirds in Colorado. So I'm just going to run through this very, very quickly for anyone who has not had that privilege. We do a lot of examination of the birds. We look for fat levels, pollen, parasites. We look for the breeding cycles in females. Pollen tells us a lot about what food resources the hummingbirds are finding important to them at different seasons of the year. We can sometimes detect not only that a female has laid an egg, but that she's hatched that egg. This little female had chips of eggshell clinging to her little belly. So she had obviously just recently hatched some eggs. Our very dedicated volunteers record the data the old school way on pieces of paper, not directly into a computer, but we collect huge amounts of banding, around 500 to 600 birds every year down here in southeastern Arizona. Last thing we do is we weigh them so that we can compare that with their wing length and fat score. And then we offer them a little honorarium, a little bit of sugar water. But having these birds in hand, being able to do extensive photo documentation and see the variation in plumage, the changes in an individual bird from its juvenile plumage to various adult plumages, all of this has been very helpful to me as a field guide author. I certainly could not have written the Peterson Field Guide to Hummingbirds without all of this in-hand knowledge of hummingbirds. There just simply is no substitute for being up close and personal with these birds. And I'm very pleased and privileged to have been able to share all this with you through the Peterson Field Guide to Hummingbirds. The new field guide will be coming out hopefully by the end of this year. There's some wrinkles in the production process that we're going to have to overcome, but I wanted to give you a quick preview of what the new plates are going to look like. The images are going to be much bigger and clearer. They're vignetted so that they're more like traditional field guide style illustrations, although using photographs because hummingbirds are notoriously hard to paint. Some of the things that people really enjoyed about the first edition will be in the new edition as well. The tails and heads plates, for example, but we'll also have more attention paid to those very important primary shapes that help us distinguish the females and juvenile males from one another at those very challenging times of year when we're not seeing the adult males. One of the most important things that hummingbirds have helped us with through the Bird Observatory and through our banding studies is making connections between people and nature. It is truly an honor and a privilege for us and our team of volunteers to be able to share these events with the public. We're so glad this year with everybody getting vaccinated and the understanding how we can use the social distancing and masks and things to help keep us safe from COVID-19, to be able to resume banding in front of the public again and being able to continue to make those connections between people and birds. There's so many species that are magnificent, iconic, that we humans, just as individuals, can't do very much to help. But hummingbirds are different. Hummingbirds, we can help. We can make a difference for hummingbirds. And we hope that the work that we're doing with our banding studies and our outreach with programs like this to singing to the choir, basically preaching to the choir on bird conservation, that we can help win more fans for hummingbirds and other migratory birds, for hummingbirds and other pollinators, and help to make the earth a safer and more prosperous place for all species. We can help by keeping our feeders clean, by planting, by putting out nectar. All of these things can help. We're all in this together.
Sheri, thank you very much for a most interesting talk.
Thank you. I'm sorry if I ran over time. I do get wound up. Let me run through my thank you slide real quick.
Okay.
I have to thank Bill for his invitation. Have to thank the birds, of course. And here's some contact information for us for anybody that would like to connect with me directly through my personal website or with the Bird Observatory. So thank you very much. And if there's any questions, if we have time, I'll be glad to answer.
Yes, we have quite a few. Thanks so
Okay.
much for a most interesting talk, Sheri. One of our viewers said that she's noticed hummingbirds swinging like a pendulum in tall grass just above the ground. Do you know what they are doing?
That is a different display from the dive display. It's a more intimate display that we call the shuttle display. If they're diving low over the grass like that, that means there's a female or a rival male there nearby, probably trying to hide from the assertive bird. And again, the different shuttle displays vary from species to species. Most of them just kind of go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Some of them, they're actually, my favorite is the plain-capped starthroat, which instead of going horizontal goes vertical. So there are different styles of shuttle display, just as there are different styles and sounds associated with the flight display.
Okay. You've mentioned that there's thousands of ruby-throated hummingbirds in Veracruz. Are there other rivers of hummingbirds locations?
Wow, there's some famous canyons off of Durango Highway in western Mexico that attract a lot of migrating southbound migrant birds, as well as the local resident birds. That's a place where you can see, Rufus and Allen's and black-chinned and even ruby-throated hummingbirds, along with white-eared and bumblebee hummingbird and Mexican violet ears and all kinds of things in some of these flower-filled canyons along the Durango Highway. But that the Veracruz phenomenon is really very special. The same sort of phenomena, the layout of the landscape with the mountains and the ocean that tends to concentrate the birds of prey and other large bird migrants also tend to concentrate the hummingbirds. And that time of year, there's just a wealth of flowers there that help support those southbound ruby-throateds as they make their way around the Gulf of Mexico in the fall on their way to southern Mexico or Central America. Okay.
And how do the females survive incubation without food since the males are gone, is the question.
That is an excellent question. These little females, for one thing, their eggs are very durable. Their eggs can take long periods of chilling when the female is away from the nest to forage for herself. But they are also, hummingbirds, one of the things I didn't really discuss is torpor. That is a very dramatic reduction in energy usage. Now that also causes, when the birds go into torpor, it's almost a hibernation-like state. It's more like hibernation than what bears do in the winter. In fact, it's more like true hibernation. So they can drop their body temperature and they can drop their breathing and respiration and everything. Of course, that's not good for developing eggs in little tiny delicate nestlings, but female hummingbirds can modify their metabolism to still keep the eggs warm, and they can kind of seal the nest so that the heat is trapped inside. Their nests also have very high R value while dialing down their own energy usage and using their energy resources as effectively as possible so that they can get through those long incubation periods, get through the brooding periods when the babies are still delicate and have to be tended most of the time, while still making forays out to feed themselves.
Okay, and there's a question related to that. Do hummingbirds sometimes hang upside down while they are sleeping in a state of torpor?
Yeah, not naturally. That tends to be that tends to be mostly a consequence of a bird in severe energy deficit landing on the slick plastic perch of a feeder and losing its grip. That wouldn't normally happen in the wild unless it was a very unusually thin branch or an unusually slick branch. Maybe one that's coated with ice in a storm or something like that. But that's not a natural position for birds to be sleeping in. They're frequently seen that way, but it's almost always on a feeder. And the feeder is key to understanding what's happening there. Mostly it's birds that are just in severe energy deficit and they just didn't arrive at the feeder in time to get that energy into their bodies and perk up before they just, lost it and lost their grip. Okay.
And why would North Carolina have more species of hummingbirds than South Carolina?
That's an excellent question, isn't it? North Carolina is actually pretty well positioned in that, being on the coast, it catches a lot of those birds that just their compasses are a little bit off, and they, fly and fly and fly and fly until either their instinct stops them or until some natural barrier stops them. So a lot of those birds kind of pile up on the coast. And it's also a state where there are a lot of hummingbird enthusiasts, and there's been hummingbird banding going on. So there's a network of hummingbird watchers and connected with the hummingbird banding community that have been able to document things that have never ended up on eBird, would never end up on eBird, simply because these are folks outside the birding mainstream. These are folks who are really dedicated hummingbird enthusiasts. They're anxious to see anything new and different in the hummingbird world, but warblers and flycatchers and vireos, not so much.
Uh-huh. And then you had mentioned that in Colorado, somewhere between 11 and 13 species of hummingbirds have been recorded. Can you just reel off the names of them for us?
You're really putting me on the spot there.
Well,
black-chined questions. Anna's costas, broad-tailed rufus. I don't think you got an Allen's yet. I don't remember an Allen's yet, but calliope, Mexican violet ear, white-eared, and
you mentioned costas.
Pardon?
Costas?
I think I did say
Costas?
costas, Annas and costas. I don't think you've had Lucifer. I can't reel them all off.
Okay. Who's counting?
Pretty much all the western migrating species, plus ruby-throateds, plus those occasional Mexican vagrants, the white-eared and Mexican violet ear in particular, which we're very envious actually in Arizona, because we've never had a Mexican violet ear in Arizona yet that we know of anyway. But
okay. Another question, this person, despite putting unused hummingbird food in the refrigerator, the mold develops in the container.
Oh.
Is there any insights as to preventing that?
Boiling the solution briefly or making it with boiling hot water. Of course, you either have to let it cool, or what I do is I add half the water as boiling water and then stir it up and get it well dissolved, and then add enough ice cubes to make up for the remainder of the water. And that gives me the proper dilution, an relatively accurate dilution, and it gets it down to serving temperature a little more quickly. But sometimes, especially if you're using the store brand sugars, they often contain more dust and spores. Kind of an unpleasant thing to think about, but they are often a little more contaminated than the name brand sugars are. And that can lead to some persistent spoiling issues. Also, make sure you put it in a very clean container when you store it, because if the container hasn't been thoroughly scrubbed out and there's little mold colonies still in there waiting for food, they're going to just pop right back to life as soon as you put that sugar water in there.
Okay, and then also a question about person would wonder about the necessity of putting roosting boxes out as shelters for migrating hummingbirds in inclement
Hummingbirds
weather.
don't really use that kind of shelter. Now, some people who are hosting wintering hummingbirds in very cold areas will build a little shelter and stick a few branches and stuff inside with like a heat lamp or some old-fashioned Christmas lights in it to warm it up. But there's mixed results on that. Hummingbirds don't usually use those kinds of shelters. What's more important is having thick, densely foliaged evergreen trees, pines, junipers, some of our evergreen oaks here in the Southwest, and of course over into the Southeast, the southern live oak are very good trees for hummingbirds to seek shelter in. But they not only don't use nest boxes, they don't even really use roosting shelters.
Okay. And then a question, do hummingbirds ever nest near raptors for safety, like
yes, that's something that would be just one more thing to cram into my very long program. But yes, that's actually something that's long been suspected, because it's something that naturalists, generations and generations of naturalists have observed with other small birds. Is that they're putting into practice the human saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Those large birds of prey, whether it's Cooper's hawks, those are the best studied, or red tails, or even broad-winged hawks, gray hawks have been seen to have this effect happening around them as well here in Arizona. Hummingbirds will preferentially nest in this cone of protection under these raptor nests, where the vigilant adult raptors are keeping away the kinds of predators that really like to raid hummingbird nests, whether it's jays, snakes, other large songbirds, small mammals, things like squirrels will raid nests, and all of those will give those nesting birds of prey a wide berth. Stay out of their way.
Okay. And the last one, is there a theory about why there's so many hummingbirds have white dots behind their eyes?
I get asked that a lot, and it apparently is a vestige of a long white line behind the eye, that some hummingbirds, their ancestors had that long white stripe behind the eye, but it got narrower and shorter, and finally there's nothing but this little white spot. Now, whether that white spot has any sort of function, whether it's an aid to visual acuity somehow, like, I don't know, like wiping black stuff under your eyes if you're a football player, or if you're Rambo or whatever. We don't really know, but it may just be something that's just a holdover from a common ancestor that had a white stripe behind the eye. Because a lot of hummingbirds still have white stripes behind the eye. Many species do.
Okay. Are you going to be doing birding tours this year, Sheri?
We are trying to get back into the tour business. We're kind of dipping our toes back in, but for now we're staying very, very busy with managing Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary and getting started with our spring hummingbird banding season and our walks on the San Pedro River. But we do hope this winter to be able to go back to Trinidad and Tobago. And next year we have plans in the works to visit Brazil and also the River of Raptors in Veracruz.
Very good. Well, listen, thank you so much, and thanks for all the interesting information.
I so appreciate being here. Thanks for everything that Denver Field Ornithologist does.
Wonderful. Dave,
and thanks to the library for hosting us. We appreciate it.
Oh, it's great. Sheri, that was one wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Dave.
I'd like for you to continue for another hour.
Be careful what you wish for.
That's right. Would you be so kind as to unshare your screen?
I absolutely will.
Oh, thank you.
Let's see. Let's see. Pause share. Stop share. There we go.
Oh, great. Well, that's our program for tonight. And a video of this program will be available on DFO's website, dfobirds.org. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance tonight. Please take care of yourself and each other. Stay safe and well, and good night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Oh, it's
Dave,
great.
you wanted to stay on. That was great, Sheri.
Oh, that was
what a terrific
I'm sorry
talk.
I went on so long. I really have to run through this and try to time myself so I don't get off on these tangents, but I do get off on a lot of tangents.
Oh, Sheri, it was so well attended and all the way to the end. It was just
great.
Thank you.
I see the numbers dropping. What were our numbers at the peak?
We had 216 at the peak.
Awesome. Woo.
And
That's a great
it started dropping after about an hour and 15 minutes. But right,
people had other things to do, dinner on the stove, and
but surprisingly, most people stayed with us for sure. Yeah.
Oh, that I do appreciate your forbearance. You could have yanked me off stage. You could have just muted my mic.
It was 206 people after an hour and 15 minutes of the program.
Wow.
And that includes announcements. Remember, we had like 20 minutes announcements. So it wasn't all your program. So yeah, we had 200.
That is awesome. I'm glad it was so well attended. That's wonderful.
We only lost 10 over an hour and 15 minutes.
Well, they may have had something else they needed to do, and they can watch the recording. I'm glad it's been recorded and will be available on the website. That's wonderful. I can point some of my friends and family to that.
Plus, we've in past speakers, we've had like 40 and 50% that have pre-registered that have not shown up.
Yeah.
We thought it was due to us, so we've now sent out reminders to people. But we found from people that have had other programs, Zoom programs, they're having equally no shows where there's no, where it's free, There's no cost. So they're running like 40 and 50%. This was about less than 30%.
Wow,
So,
that's great. Well, I'm honored and very pleased with that. That's wonderful.
Yeah. I think of the programs we've had, this has been the most people that have the percentage that have shown up.
Right.
Yeah.
That's awesome. It's
Even
a
though
very
to me,
popular topic. Well, I hope it gets more people interested in DFO.
Yeah,
Well,
we hope so too.
yeah. Well, and you're not doing, you said you're not doing many of these presentations. You haven't.
No, oddly enough, I had it's almost like there was just this sudden sea change or something. And a lot of organizations that really hadn't been doing much of anything during the pandemic suddenly realized they could do Zoom programs. So I had about a month when I had a half dozen requests to do presentations, and a couple of them I had to turn down because they conflicted with one another. So, but you know, I have another couple of presentations coming up for birding groups in California, and I'm actually going to be doing a hummingbird garden roundtable sort of seminar program for American Bird Conservancy in mid-April.
Oh, how nice. Well, I'm glad you're keeping busy, and that's
taking on Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary, that has really kept us busy. Very, very busy. I never imagined this late in my career that I would be taking on such a huge project, but it has been tremendously rewarding. And now that travel is starting to open back up, we're really looking forward to seeing a lot of our friends from all over the country and really all over the world, people who are admirers of Mary Jo Ballator, but also folks who have come with us on various trips and that we've spent time with here in southeastern Arizona over the years. We're looking forward to seeing them again. It's been kind of a lonely year for those of us who have spent a lot of time birding with other people, but it's really good to see with the vaccination rates and people minding their social distancing and mask requirements and everything, that we're starting to maybe see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad you stepped up after Mary Jo passed away.
We were lucky to be in the right place at the right time, but it would not have happened. We really didn't. Our organization is so small that we didn't have the resources, even like a mailing list of donors that we could call on to fund the purchase of the property. It took Mary Jo's very, very good friend, Tony Batiste, who owns Batiste B&B just a few miles away, he was racking his brain because he did not want to see his dear friend Mary Jo's legacy evaporate under our noses. We'd had too many situations where places that had offered hospitality to birders had, because of poor planning on the part of the host, had suddenly become unavailable. The most famous of which is Sally Spofford's place over in Portal, that Sally told many people that she had made arrangements in her will for her place to be open to the birders into perpetuity, but that didn't happen. And then when the Patton family, when that situation came along and William Marion Patton passed away, something had to be done there. And fortunately, Tucson Audubon Society, Victor Emanuel Nature Tours, and American Bird Conservancy stepped up there. But there really wasn't anybody stepping up that had the resources for it. But Tony was able to find a person with whom he has some family connections, a couple with whom he has some family connections that are birders and outdoor lovers, nature lovers. And he said, I know you two are donors to good causes. I have a good cause that I want you to consider. Because, as they say in the nonprofit world, you don't ask, you don't get. So he asked, and bless them, we worked up this big, 5-page detailed proposal for how we would manage the sanctuary and everything. And they approved the donation even before they got our proposal. They were so impressed with Tony's love of this place and his love of Mary Jo, but also with Sabo's reputation that we've been around for so long, and and really know this area and know the people. And, we're also good friends of Mary Jo's and devastated by her passing. So it has been quite a learning experience taking over the job that one woman used to do by herself. And we have this crew of people that has to do all this stuff.
You still have
Mary
her
Jo,
parrot?
she was just a force of nature, bless her heart.
Yeah.
Do you still have her parrot? Her parrot?
No, her parrot has joined her in eternity.
Oh.
That's the way they both would have wanted it. I think they were inseparable. And
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, this is great. Well, it's great to chit chat with you and just ad lib a little bit and glib a little bit and enjoy this, anyway. Sheri, you're just.
Well, I certainly appreciate the invitation. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Jim.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you,
You're
Kim.
welcome.
Thanks to
You're welcome.
Oliver as well. He's off doing something else, but I really appreciate this opportunity. Colorado is a very special place in my heart, and I look forward to getting back on the road and getting up to visiting you all sometime soon.
Oh, it's
I
great.
hope to get down to Asa Wright in March, the end of March of next year.
Bill, Asa Wright is closed now.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah. Because of COVID. Yeah.
Yes,
How's it look for
and
opening?
we really don't know what the future holds for Asa Wright, although they are still maintaining it as a sanctuary, just without public access right now. But that is opening up ecotourism opportunities for other folks in Trinidad and Tobago. Asa Wright was just kind of the big dog on the block, and they kept a lot of entrepreneurs from initiating their own lodging operations and feeding operations and things like that, because Asa Wright just dominated. So we're actually looking forward to getting back to Trinidad and seeing what has come out of the creation of this vacuum by the closure of Asa Wright. It is a fabulous place, a very special place, but that whole country is wonderful and full of wonderful people. And I'm confident that they're going to pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and get right back on the ecotourism train.
Way to go. Way to go.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you all. I appreciate
thank
it.
you.
Have a great night. Everybody stay safe and well, and we'll see you somewhere down the road.
Well, lots of luck to you. Best to what you're doing.